Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us in our webinar on Assessing Your Financial Risk in 2025, a three-level framework. And this webinar is sponsored by Jitasa. So I'm going to take a few seconds and read a message from our sponsor. Jitasa is a bookkeeping, accounting, and fractional CFO service provider that works exclusively with nonprofits. Their team serves over 1,500 organizations across the nation and has helped nonprofits organize their finances since 2008. Jitasa is committed to helping nonprofits that are dedicated to making the world a better place, and their teams truly understand the unique financial challenges faced by these noble organizations. Whether you need help filing your annual 990, organizing your grant funding, ensuring your revenue and expenses are properly recorded, or other financial services, Jitasa can help. So for more information, please visit jitasa.com at jitasa.com. And thank you again, Jitasa, for sponsoring today's webinar. And now I'm going to introduce you to our presenters for today. We have many presenters today. Our first presenter, which is going to be our main presenter, is Hilda Polenko, who is Market Managing Principal at BDO. And we also have presenting today one of our moderators, Dana Brito, who is also Principal of Cultivar Consulting, and our own Ruth McCambridge, Director of Content. And then we have two case studies who will be sharing their personal stories with us today. Teresa Stanford Wright, Chief Executive Director of Hope and Healing Survivor Resource Center, and Lauren Thies, Director, Fund Development at 904 Ward. And our moderator for today is Wade Rogers, who is also a financial consulting and trainer for nonprofits. And before we move on, I'd like to lay a few ground rules for our webinar today. We're asking for everyone to please be respectful in the chat and avoid any type of solicitation of any services. If you want to promote any of your services, you can do so by sending myself an email at amanda@anelson@nonprofitfinancials.org. And we ask that any services or any type of products that are being talked about in the chat, that we will then, one of our moderators may reach out to you and let you know that that is not something we're going to allow in today's webinar, just to be respectful, not only to the others in the chat, but our sponsor and the presenters on today's webinar. So please do not solicit any of your programs or services in the chat. And we also ask that when you receive the recording and slides for today's webinar, that you do attribute that to the presenters that are going to be presenting their information today. Our presenters are sharing their original work, and they've worked hard to put that information together. So if you are going to be utilizing any information that you receive from the webinars today, please give the presenter the credit for that work. We want to make sure that anyone that is presenting on our webinars feels comfortable sharing their information and knowing that they're going to get credit for the work that they're putting together. So if you have any questions about the use of any of the work that is going to be shared today, or how you are able to use it, again, you can send me an email at anelson@nonprofitfinancials.org, and I can let you know how to attribute that work to the presenter and what you are and are not able to share and how. And before we move on, I'd just like to take a second and just let you know and remind you that Nonprofit Financial Commons is a nonprofit. And that means that we do depend on you, our community, to invest in us as we in a partnership, not only through sharing your knowledge, but financially. We depend on you to help us bring resources like this webinar to nonprofits of all sizes, regardless of their budget. So today, we are going to drop a link in the chat for you to make a donation to Nonprofit Financial Commons. And if you see fit to do so, we do ask that you take the time to show that you value the resources and the information that we are sharing and that we are bringing to you and other nonprofits, and show your support through making a donation to Nonprofit Financial Commons. And with that, I will turn it over to Dana.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. Lovely to see everyone chiming in through the chat. If you haven't already, let us know who you are and where you are tuning in from. As Amanda mentioned, my name is Dana Brito, and I am a moderator for our Nonprofit Financial Commons team. Before we start off, and I think before we present any frameworks around financial risk, I think we wanted to take a moment to really recognize current moment that we're in, and also I think we would be remiss if we didn't really acknowledge some of the risks that we're already seeing at play, and already seeing nonprofits experience, particularly over the past couple of weeks or few weeks, feels like longer. Or particularly as it relates to federal funding sources. So using some recent study and data compiled by Candid, want to walk you through, again, what that data says and what it highlights in terms of the impact of potential losses, especially large losses at the federal level, and provide a sense of what that means and the potential ripple effects across the sector. So next slide. So like I mentioned, Candid, I think back in February, a few weeks back, did a great study, and they poured over most recently available 990 data. And we're really trying to track, of all organizations who have submitted 990s over the past year, who is receiving government grants. Keyword being grants, though, because of how, for any organizations that receive any type of fee-for-service government contracts, depending how that's included in the 990s, it's not always cleanly separated or designated as government funding. So what you're seeing on the screen really just represents a small slice of the federal funding pie, in that it only represents government grants and not necessarily fee-for-service government contracts. And so as it relates to those grants, you're seeing that particularly as organizations get larger, they're more likely to have receive government grants, most likely because, again, typically these grants have pretty rigorous compliance requirements and administrative needs that typically larger nonprofits have the infrastructure and the systems for. But regardless, I think, again, a huge finding is that at least 100,000, and that's underreporting, again, because this is just grants, not contracts, at least 100,000 nonprofits are receiving government grants to the tune of about $303 billion. And again, once you hit that over 5 million mark, that percentage of those that are receiving significant amount of that increases in size. So I'll talk a little bit about this later, but those organizations who receive significant amounts of government funding will very likely be impacted by any potential losses, particularly at the federal level, and especially given their trickle-down effect if you are receiving any federal pass-through grants as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of the type of organizations that rely on government grants for the majority of their revenue, I don't think this will come as a big surprise, but certainly seeing a high dependence, particularly for organizations in the human services space. So settlement houses, organizations that provide counseling, any work, human service work directly in the communities, or really anchor institutions in communities, obviously are receiving a lot of government grant funding. International foreign affairs have already seen significant risk and significant cuts and freezes for organizations who receive especially federal grants in that space. but also, again, any organizations like education also seeing, again, for those of you who've been keeping track of what's happening at the Department of Education, significant amounts of funding just in form of grants, never mind contracts that are going towards education. But even organizations in the arts and culture space, that's a pretty it's not an immaterial amount of arts and culture organizations that are receiving some type of government grants. So again, I think what this all states is that there will be even though I think, again, human services and certainly international and foreign affairs will have a pretty significant impact by any potential government cuts. It really is a wide swath of organizations that receive this money. And so the ripple effects will likely be pretty broad and wide ranging for sure. So next slide, please. So I think, and especially in while we were putting together the content for this, I think we had a lot of conversations about the fact that I think any revenue source has its potential risks. I know Hilda will be talking a lot about potential framework for thinking about those risks going forward. But historically, even though changes in administration could always potentially lead to some hiccups or some changes in government funding, historically, once you secured government funding, it could there could be years when there could be some level of reductions or changes. But historically, it's a source that many organizations considered at least somewhat or relatively predictable. And that paradigm and that norm is being shifted completely. And it's now becoming much more of a wild card than it ever has. And I think, like we said, we talked about organizations are already being impacted by both freezes and outright cuts. And again, that's before this new administration passes their first budget under their administration. So like I mentioned, those organizations, especially if you're over $5 million, because they're more likely to have greater levels and have a greater dependence on government grants, the impact of those on those larger organizations is probably pretty likely, if not certain. But even smaller organizations that receive smaller portions of government grants, depending on your mission area, your issue area, what you represent, and how that may or may not reflect the current administration's values and priorities. I think we've already seen and heard stories of levels of increased scrutiny around what is allowable and what is not allowable, and particularly for issue areas or segments of the population that are particularly in the crosshairs of the current administration. Funding that is going towards those marginalized communities is very much under scrutiny and creating all compliance issues and problems. And again, as it relates to compliance, like we talked about, smaller organizations who don't have the same compliance infrastructure or contract management support or systems can really be hindered and can really feel the effects of that in a way that larger organizations may or may not. So again, I think this is another issue or another way of really highlighting the fact that if you receive any type of government funding, the impacts you will likely receive are could be broad ranging, could impact a wide swath of organizations going forward, not just because of the dependence on and the availability of the dollars, but because of the scrutiny and the compliance issues that it may represent, depending on what your mission or issue is area and the communities that you represent. So next slide, please. So I think even if you don't receive a single cent of government funding, I do think the effects of this will be again pretty wide ranging. And I think again we got questions leading up to the webinar around how does this crisis compare to other periods of crisis like COVID or the Great Recession. And I think again at that point, and you might remember, again, it's literally almost exactly 5 years ago, there was a wide response at the federal level, first through programs like the Paycheck Protection Program, and then eventually ARPA. And then there were, again, other private funders even were doing a lot of these rapid response, very quick, swift efforts to raise funds during a time of crisis. Whereas in this case, it is almost the reverse. And in fact, that federal sources are actually shrinking. And so because of that, even private funding may become more unpredictable, particularly if certain individual foundation or corporate donors are shifting their priorities and their strategies and focus based on any major threats that are happening at the federal level. And so, and also in addition to that, foundations themselves, while a huge source of revenue across the sector, they cannot completely foot the bill for any major funding losses. And so based on that candid study that we were just reviewing, they would need to increase their estimated grant making by about 282% just to fully offset complete cuts in government grants. And again, that does not include fee-for-service contracts, which can represent significant sources of revenue for nonprofits across the country. And so I think given that, I think that we would be remiss if we did not emphasize here that the competition for private funding will most likely increase, especially if there are any really significant material cuts at the federal level. So, and so given that, again, I think this is the moment for all of us to be really thoughtful about thinking about how we are assessing risk, financial risk in particular, reputational risk, mission vision risk, and really being thoughtful about the fact that things that may have been steady and predictable in the past may not be so going forward, and really focusing on those key areas that represent biggest risk for you, and building enough of a runway to plan for and to mitigate risk and to make sure that you're building a pathway, whether it be through scenario planning, conversations with your board staff, and making sure you're being really thoughtful about thinking about the biggest financial risks to your organization in the current environment. And so with that, I will hand it off to Hilda.
Thank you so much, Dana, and thank you all who have chosen to join us this afternoon. My name is Hilda Polanco, and I'm the Market Managing Principal for BDO, working specifically with nonprofits and the grant makers that support them. And in the last few weeks, I would say, to Dana's point of the question of how similar or different is this to COVID, I have felt that some of my conversations were a page right out of March 2020. And of course, with not everyone facing the same challenges as we did with COVID, but being more of where am I personally as an organization and how will I be impacted? As of today, it's hard to know on an organizational level how exactly the organization will be impacted. We know that on a daily basis, we receive additional information about the changes that are expected. Then they slow down a little bit with the courts reacting, and then we move forward. So I think part of what I'm hoping is a takeaway for you today is that you begin this assessment as soon as possible if you haven't already. And the assessment is a fluid assessment. We think about what is the risk landscape for your organization. And I'm going to walk you through 3 particular levels that we've identified in our work with leaders. You might see 4 or 5, depending on where you are personally, or for those of you who are working with multiple organizations. It's hard to know that it's exactly 3, but this is where we've built the framework to see in general. So the first level of risk is really minimal impact. An organization is looking at their revenue sources, at least for the foreseeable future, be it the next 6 months. And let me say this, that we are not talking about multi-year risk assessment here. We're talking about for the foreseeable future, which we know changes on a weekly basis. But let's say for the next 6 months, identifying what are the changes in revenue that might come either directly from the federal or the sort of trickle effect on the private level, foundations and individuals. And so for this minimal expected impact, the programs are sustained, maybe moderately reduced. There's a focus on what we call controllable expenses. So what are the expenses that are today being covered by your unrestricted resources? What are the expenses that an organization has control over and may choose not to incur if they don't have the funding for it? And there isn't really significant impact to the mission in any foreseeable way. So that's, let's call it level 1 of risk. And you might realize that in order for me to answer these questions, I really have to do my revenue analysis and really understand my expenses. So we hope that you more than ever will be spending the time and energy to have up-to-date, reliable, data-informed financial information that allows you to make this assessment. That's level 1. Level 2, we're really talking about significant area of risk. And I've chosen to call this a period for business model recalibration. And so the business model as it is today, which we know a business model is really about how we fund our strategy, that model is not sustainable in its current form. There's significant funding decreases from either one or multiple revenue sources. And it's bringing you to really ask yourself, what is our value proposition in the sector? What are we able to maintain and provide? What are we uniquely positioned to continue to provide? And what are the program areas that perhaps have been funded from unrestricted resources or programs that you're feeling maybe we just have to wind these programs down. Maybe we're really focusing on a core set of services. And we do realize that from a staffing or an infrastructure perspective, we may need to make some significant reductions. And in that context, understanding what are those program areas becomes really critical as soon as you feel like you have enough data. And this framework is more directional. The idea of perfection or complete accuracy or complete clarity is probably not something that's reasonable to expect in this time frame. So we're doing the best with the information that we have. And I realize that as we move down the spectrum, the second level, you'll find yourself making some pretty significant decisions around staffing, which is, of course, a pretty important aspect that we need to really be thoughtful about before the decision is made. And then we get to the third, which we've chosen to describe as existential redefinition. You've thought about the business model recalibration. You've thought about all the different ways in which programs can be re-envisioned, they can be reprioritized. And based on the various challenges, and it may take a little bit to get to this assessment, you've looked at all of the revenue sources and expected impacts. And it's really not sustainable in the current form, and restructuring of some sort is in the horizon. Now, in this particular level of risk assessment, you may be considering fiscal sponsorship as an option. You may be a standalone organization today, or even in the the mid-level risk, you may want to just consider what would it mean to be fiscally sponsored by an organization with the back office and purchasing power of a fiscal sponsor. Might that make sense? This is not an answer that's a one size fits all or applicable or even possible for everyone on the call. But what might that look like as a way to preserve the programmatic quality and the programmatic ability to deliver with an opportunity to have this a part of a bigger back office infrastructure? Might there be opportunities for consolidation with other organizations that provide similar services? Or in some cases, is sunsetting an option that the organization may want to consider? And what we're seeing is in some cases, there's been almost like an immediate understanding that it's level 3 risk. And in many other cases, it's a gradual, maybe feeling like we're at minimal, and then moving to the right as more information is available. So my big takeaway here is this is not a one-time exercise. This is an exercise that begins by understanding the impacts and then understanding if your organization is moving to the right of the landscape, what what are the decisions you're making? As you might imagine, it's very difficult to articulate such a complex concept in one slide. And so we at the Financial Commons will be collaborating to come back with a short publication on how to think about how we get to these assessments, and what are the questions we need to be asking, and where does that information come from, and what are the steps that we take once we understand which level of risk we're in. So Amanda, I would love for you to launch our poll, which helps us think about, and when I say us, those participating here today, and I ask if you're an advisor and not a nonprofit yourself, please do not answer the poll, so that we can leave this poll results to really represent the nonprofit leaders in the room and where you're feeling. And think of this as just your gut. In the last 5 minutes, that's not enough time, as we know, for you to really be thoughtful about these answers. But if you had to give it a gut, where do you see yourself today, or where do you see yourself in the next month or two, to be able to really start to entertain what some of the options are that are in front of you? And we'll share, obviously, this is all anonymous. We'll share the results so that you have a sense as to who's with us today and where the organizations that are present today may find themselves. Okay, well, here we are. So about 40% of you feel like you're in a minimal impact. A little bit over 50% see the significant risk as where you find yourselves. And there's a small percent, about 6%, that feel like you're in an existential redefinition stage. There is obviously no right or wrong answer here. The most important part is that you've identified where you may be. And again, as of today, we could go back and do this poll for the same group 2 months from now and have a different answer. Most important that you are able to understand the trigger points. What would take you from minimal to significant, and what would take you from significant to existential? What are the events that need to or may happen that might create that shift for you? And so with that framing, we also want you to be with us and engage in understanding what some leaders are experiencing today, and how they're reacting to their own landscape analysis, and be able to share with you. So I'm going to pass the baton back to Dana, who's going to be starting our conversation with our guest.
Thank you so much, Hilda. So for today's webinar, as we do for many of our webinars, we have the very unique and privileged opportunity to hear from the field and to hear from people who have gone through it and who are currently going through it. And I think we were very intentional around selecting the stories that we did for our case studies today. So I have the pleasure of interviewing Lauren Thias, who is the Director of Fund Development at 904 Forward. I'll be interviewing her first, and then we'll also have the pleasure of hearing eventually from Teresa Stafford Wright, the Chief Executive Director for Hope and Healing Survivor Resource Center. And we very intentionally chose these stories because I think these are two organizations and leaders of such who represent organizations that are very much in the crosshairs from a values and mission perspective, based on what's happening in the current political climate, and I think have some very powerful stories of resilience, but also just best effective practices and really bold and courageous leadership in the wake of very not only material financial risk, but also risk to your identities and your values as an organization. So with that, again, I have the pleasure of speaking with Lauren Thias. Lauren, thank you so much for being here with us today. And just to start us off, it would be great if you could tell us a little bit about who you are, your role, your organization, and your organization's budget size.
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you so much for allowing me to chat with everybody today. I hope that folks get at least a few tidbits from me. And if nothing else, I really do hope that the folks on the call, I know there are hundreds of folks on the call. I hope that folks realize that part of what this is about is remembering that you are not alone, and that we are in community together. So
Absolutely.
as Dana said, I'm Lauren Thias. I'm with 90 Forward. We are a racial equity nonprofit in Jacksonville, Florida. If you're not familiar, Jacksonville is the northeast part of the state. So in many ways is very deep south. And so we have been dealing with this kind of work for many years now. I know some of the stuff that we're seeing is newer to some communities, and we've kind of been that bellwether. So we've been through it a bit. We are, of course, still going through it now with new changes. Our organization current budget is around 1.5 million. We've seen some increases and decreases through the years, but that's where we sit right now.
Wonderful. And so again, your organization focused on racial equity in Florida, in Deep South. So, and given your operating or your genesis story, can you tell us a little bit about your operating history to date, and particularly highlight your revenue mix and how that has shifted, particularly in recent years?
Absolutely. So when we were founded in 2015, it was a very small volunteer group. And for a couple of years, that group was intentionally all volunteer. They didn't even make it a nonprofit. They really wanted it to have that flexibility. But what they found pretty quickly was that we did need to raise some funds for some of our programming. So in 2017, we became an official nonprofit. And so we did the work for a few years, and really it was driven by volunteers. It was not a big fundraising operation. Lots of the work, like I said, unfunded or funded out of people's pockets. And then 2020 hit. And like so many communities throughout the country, we here in Jacksonville got a collaborative of funders, recognized the importance of the work, reached out to our local community foundation, and made a significant multi-year gift that enabled us to hire staff and really start to put some money behind the work we were doing. As is so often the case in this type of work, it also fairly quickly fell out of that big favor. And so we saw some retraction pretty quickly after that. Nothing we were changing in our work. If anything, we were being more effective because we had, again, that funding behind us. And so we saw ups and downs. 2 years ago now, we had a racially motivated shooting in the city. We saw that funding increase. And so we've seen a shift from really large foundation donors and individuals who give through the community foundation here in town. We did see some success with some national funders, which was wonderful. Again, they have come and gone. We've just based on the work, not really based on our delivery of services. It's always been fantastic. It's just what's popular, what's not, right? And so one of the things that we really wanted to make sure we did was go back to the basics almost and really look at those day-to-day individual givers who give at a more modest level. The tricky part of that, of course, I'm sure everybody on the call knows the data, right? We're seeing nationally the trend away from small gifts. And so it's really in many ways counterintuitive, but it's the foundation of the work, and certainly work like this that can be very controversial for certain folks. Again, we've been in a space where this has been fairly unpopular with our legislature for a number of years. And so we've really just stuck with it. And we continue to look at what that balance needs to be and find partners at all levels who are committed to the work itself, not the popularity of the work, but those folks who really are in it in a much more deep and meaningful way.
Understood. And so you had mentioned sort of this, which happens, right? Falling out of favor with some of the larger donors, which happens to many nonprofits and several points throughout their organizational life cycle. And it sounded like, again, didn't necessarily, once that funding shifted, didn't sound like there were huge changes or shifts in how you approached your programming or mission impact. Can you elaborate on that a little more? One, is that true? And two, how did you double down, if so?
So great question. And one of the most critical things that our organization has been fortunate to have is a board that's really committed to this work. So as just some foundational information, you have to volunteer with our nonprofit before you can serve on the board. So you have to really prove that you care about this work. It's not a fundraising board.
Mhm.
For better or worse, sometimes certainly we
Yep.
would love to get those, here, write your $10,000 check and we won't see you for another year. But that is not what we have done. And that's been very intentional because we know that we need to have strong alignment. And so we have, throughout the course of the history of this organization, always made sure that the board is in alignment with the mission and that we're all in alignment from a staff mission board perspective. And we have those really, really hard conversations. Certainly part of our work is having deep conversations with the community. And so we have to model that, right? We have to do that ourselves. And so we have those around risk. We've been talking about our tolerance for risk. And I know sometimes when we talk about risk, we think about cybersecurity or physical risk. We've even had to start having security at events, that kind of thing. But we've talked about risk and what we're comfortable doing and saying. And so, for example, there's legislation in our state. It's called there's anti-woke legislation, I'll say. And so does the phrase DEI need to change? And for us, again, with the board and with the staff, we've been fortunate that we've had that strong alignment that this is our work and those words do matter and we're not going to back away from them. And that goes to the programming as well, which is not to say we continue to do stuff just because it's right. We do have to look at everything. We look at our programming constantly. Is it the most effective use of our time, of the dollars that we have been entrusted with? And is it going to make the biggest impact? And so we look at that regularly. And I mean regular. So obviously at the board level, we do an annual retreat. We have monthly committee meetings. We have staff meetings and staff retreats. And so we're always talking about this and making sure that we're using the resources we have in the most effective way. And so we have seen some changes, which is, again, not to say that we're not changing anything ever. Sometimes it's a small tweak. Sometimes we say this program just doesn't make sense anymore. What worked in 2020 doesn't work in 2025. And so we have to be really honest with ourselves about that. And again, there's the connect between the board and the staff that's really critical. We need to be on the same page because part of what we can't have is a board that says, "Oh yeah, we're on board," and then we lose a funder because of that, and then they're mad, right? So
Right.
we do have to have that genuine connection and alignment with our board, and fortunately we have that. And I know that it sounds easy and isn't always easy, but it is really, really critical.
Right. And so you talked, I think, a little bit about this again, just in your comments about the board. Obviously, like you're revisiting the relationship with language and the impact on your financial and operations sustainability. You talked a little bit about understandably needing to shift to more individual givers, even though as a source across the board, there could be some challenges there. So could you either elaborate on those points or anything that you think is anything new that you haven't mentioned yet around your approach to financial planning, monitoring, and decision making in the current environment that you think this audience would benefit from hearing about?
Absolutely. So, kind of diving in on the individual piece, this is basics. Any fundraiser on the call, right, knows this work. All of our work is relational. And so making sure we're building deep, trusting relationships with funders. We're also, I will say, and this is certainly a part of the larger conversation today, we're also looking at national funders. We know those national funders can often make significant, 6, 7, 8-figure gifts, and we welcome those as well. And so, but the key for us is finding mission alignment, making sure that the donors care about the work and that it's not just a trendy thing for them to support. Unfortunately, that is the case sometimes, and which is not to say that we don't accept dollars if there's not like deep mission alignment, right? There needs to be some alignment. We of course in this work aren't going to take money from just anybody. but really trying to build that. And that is at all levels. Again, those funders who funded in the past, they may come back. And so we continue to steward them. Those donors who continue to support, let's see if they, you know, have interest in continuing to increase or to continue in general. And so we're looking at all of the different levels again, and looking at national organizations. Florida's unique in many ways, although again, it's changed a lot, that a lot of other states are seeing some similar stuff, but finding large organizations that care about the work. And that's, I think, really critical, because one of the things we've always tried to do is not chase dollars. And that can be really hard, because if there's something that kind of fits, it can be hard to not go for it. But we really have to say what makes sense, because again, in the long run, we have to be really mindful of that. And for better or worse, we've seen that in Florida. And so we're kind of seeing what some other folks are seeing. It also doesn't always eliminate the problem. One of the things you mentioned, that Hilda mentioned, I should say, is this competition for dollars. So we've never applied for or accepted any kind of governmental funding. That's always been really intentional, and that can be tricky. We are a small organization. I didn't mention we're a team of 6. So we have a small but mighty team. But we've never accepted those dollars, but that doesn't mean that this kind of shift doesn't impact us. One of the examples I'll use, without getting into too much detail, you can certainly, I'll Google it, but our governor was dissatisfied with an arts program that happened in the state a couple of years ago and pulled all of the arts funding from the state budget. So does it impact us directly? Not necessarily, because we don't do a lot of arts related programming, but it does in the bigger picture, because now people are looking to those donors that are, you know, those bigger donors in town, or we're competing for people. And so we see it, we're impacted by it either way. And so again, it's about figuring that piece out. And it's not always easy, and we're not always 100% successful at it, but we're staying there, we're staying in it. We know that this work is super critical. And again, we know that people care about it. So we just want to continue to do that as much as we can.
Fantastic. Lauren, thank you so much for taking the time, one, to be here, and thank you so much for the critical work that 904 Word does, and really commend the level of focus and discipline, again, like especially around, like, it's hard not to chase sometimes, but really your message around commitment to who you are and what you're doing, I think is really inspirational for all of us, and really appreciate you taking the time to be here and tell your story to all of us today. So thank you. And I will pass it along to my colleague, Ruth.
Thank you so much. And Teresa. For Teresa to come on. Hi, Teresa. Okay, so I am just really thrilled to be interviewing who I'm interviewing today, because I feel like Teresa and I have had the same work experience, 45 years apart, 50 years apart. So when Teresa and I first talked, and I heard about what kind of program that she ran and what that program is facing, it was so similar to my own experience that it was a little bizarre. So, you know, I came into this during the Reagan era. Well, that was like Reagan was elected when I was already working in violence against women's programs, and it had a pretty significant immediate effect, which it looks like is going to be the same for all of those programs now, 45 years later. So I want to, first I want to say that Teresa's organization, Teresa Stafford White, her organization is called Hope and Healing Survival Resource Center. And Teresa, I'm going to ask you, first of all, to just explain how you got into the work first, and then what's the history of the organization? How big is it? How much of it, and this could be your final point, but how much of it is dependent on government funding at this point, federal funding?
Well, thank you for having me here, and thank you for allowing me to highlight the impact, the potential impact for especially nonprofits that serve survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking within the communities across the country. So I have been doing this work now for over almost 20 years. I got involved. I am a survivor myself, and I consider myself a survivor leader. And I think it's really important that we have survivors leading in this movement to ensure that, you know, we have different approaches to doing the work at times. But Hope and Healing Survivor Resource Center, we have been in existence in Summit and Medina County in Northeast Ohio for 50 years. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary last year. We are committed to the prevention of violence through social and systemic change. While we provide trauma-informed and culturally responsive services to survivors of domestic and intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. We experience I want to just back up just a second. So we have been here before through the Victims of Crime Act, and we had to have those funding cuts roughly about 2018, 2019, where our organization had about a $1.5 million cut and had to lay off significantly and change how we do the work in the community. And it impacted the community greatly because we wasn't able to provide people. Sometimes people got told no, they wasn't able to come in a shelter. So today it's scary because we might be in that position again this year. So we rely roughly about 75% of our budget relies heavily on federal grants, and our budget is about $6 million. And we have a staffing of over 100 people that we staff on a consistent basis. So if we receive any type of federal cut, as there's a great potential that may happen, we're looking at potentially not being able to serve that survivor that made that brave decision at 3 o'clock in the morning to leave an abusive situation. We're looking at when that individual's at the hospital and they need that additional support there, where they're having a forensic medical exam after being sexually assaulted, not being able to provide that. Counseling, the free counseling that we provide. So many survivors of sexual assault don't engage in counseling until about 5 to 10 years after victimization. We have been really successful in changing that to where people are accessing our services a lot quicker, which means that the impact of their trauma decreases tremendously. And so, you know, if funding cuts happen for our organization, you know, when you all showed that slide where you talk about the 3 different areas where we're sitting in that business model recollaboration side right there. Or depending on how big of a cut, we are in the plan C, where we are looking at how do we really create a whole new operation just to ensure that the basic services are there and able to be able to provide for communities.
Right. So that's going to be a little hair raising, and clearly things keep going back and forth. So,
Absolutely.
you know, one day you're hearing one thing, another day you're hearing another about the pot of money that you're looking at. But at the same time you're hearing about that, you're also getting pressure to change your language. So can you talk a little bit about what that is, and you know, kind of the decisions that you're being faced with right now? And this is really hitting the entire field, not just your organization. So
Yeah, it's hitting
as
our
you're
entire
meeting
field.
with other leaders, what's the conversation that's going on?
Yeah, it's, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty, like what we have to follow, what we don't have to follow. We see some of our national organizations have really been at the forefront, and they have wiped clean their websites with regards to information around the trans community, the LGBTQ plus community, serving immigrant populations. Our organization has decided that we're not going to make those changes right now because our mission is to serve all survivors. We are to serve all survivors. Our grant contracts, our federal grant contracts that we have signed and that we're operating under, they say that we're supposed to serve all survivors. VAWA says we're supposed to serve all survivors. So we have really worked hard to reach survivors that are often forgotten about. That's Black and Brown survivors, survivors from the LGBTQ plus community, trans survivors, people who don't speak English as their first language, people who have, you know, substance abuse or have a history of incarceration in the past. We have been very intentional about reaching those folks because we know that they're often the ones who are sexually assaulted or experiencing DV or human trafficking at a higher rate. So if we're not being intentional about how we do our work, then there's an opportunity that we're going to be missing the opportunity to serve all survivors. And so we haven't really changed our language. And we haven't made that decision yet because that's so core to the work we do. And I know Lauren, she talked about earlier, because her organization It is built on the basis of doing DEI, but our work, they say it's DEI work, but it's not necessarily DEI work. It is serving survivors in the way that makes it easy to serve them. It's not a cookie cutter approach. We don't approach all survivors the same. We need to make sure our services are curated in a manner that they meet the needs of the individuals that need them. And so with that, I don't say we necessarily do DEI work. We're doing the work of the people.
So given that, what have the conversations been among your colleagues? What are you talking to each other about in terms of field activities and negotiations with others, et cetera, et cetera?
So, it's really, we've had some really deep conversations. It sounds like these are the conversations, unfortunately, that in the movement that I work in, that it seems like we're always having. Every few years, we're having these conversations about how do we do our work with mandates that come down that's attached to the federal dollars. For example, a few years ago when our rape crisis centers in the state of Ohio started receiving state money from the state budget, there was mandates attached to that funding. We couldn't talk about reproductive rights with survivors. We couldn't share information with them about their reproductive choices. And so we had to figure out a way how to maneuver through those waters. And right now we're just figuring out another way how to maneuver through the water so we can still stay relevant in the communities and provide the services that we need to provide. And a lot of that is, like for training, for example, we all have training in our budgets. And sometimes that training is connected to a grant and sometimes it's not connected to the grant. I have subject matter experts in my organization, and I know my sister organizations across the county line, they have subject matter experts inside their organizations. We can just start training each other and save those dollars and put those dollars towards staffing. So how do we barter our work without necessarily having to look to put everything in the budget?
Right. And I think that as we negotiate between that second and third box, right? Moving into that third box, we begin to think about what do I really have to pay for? Yeah, and how else can I do this particular task? And it may be that in the history of your organization, as in Lauren's organization, the history is there to depend on. And then you have to figure out, okay, what is it going to take to deploy this mission in the right way? Is there anything in terms of talking with your board, talking with your constituents that you'd like to, any tips that you'd like to give other people about how important that is?
Absolutely. These conversations, it's unfortunate that I've spoke to some nonprofit leaders and they haven't had real conversations with their board or the staff members about the potential impact if funding cuts take place. And so we really need to be like laying those breadcrumbs, opening the doors with our boards, having honest conversations with our board members so they can understand their role and being able to support you when you have to start making those crucial decisions that's going to change the way the organization is operating today for tomorrow. And so also with my board, I'm really thankful that I have a strong board today, that they are individuals who are ready to be strong ambassadors for the organization, to contact legislators, to contact other individuals in the community that have social capital, that have financial capital, that can be ambassadors and speak. I am always going to speak on behalf of our organization, but when I have an ambassador in the community, somebody that's not connected to the organization, that can go to the county executive, that go to the legislators and speak on behalf, and I just say, hey, Hope and Healing has served 3,000 survivors. No, Hope and Healing is changing lives. Due to the work that they're doing, this is what we're hearing in the community and the impact. When I can have other people champion that story for me, that's the social impact that I need to have. But talking to my board and bringing them on board, giving them that list of donors that they can reach out to and saying, here's 10 donors that I need you to shepherd the relationship with and help me shepherd the relationship with. Who are the people in your circle that have influence that I should get in front of right now to help change the narrative and help share our narrative with? And so I think our boards, we really need to use them in a manner that you're not alone as a CEO, that your board is your partner, and they should be working alongside of you right now and in the trenches. But those folks on your boots on the ground inside your organization, they're going to be impacted first. Besides the people we serve, they're most likely going to be impacted first. So we need to have a level of transparency with them, also to explain it to them the game plan going forward. If A happens, then we have A, B, and C game plan in place to possibly pivot to. And I see
Right.
somebody put in the chat, like, how is it impacting our prevention work? This has always impacted our prevention work. So we could, we've always had, we can go inside of a school to do prevention, and the school would say, these are the things we don't want you to say. We don't want you to say the word rape. We don't want you to say the word sexual assault. We've always had that. We don't want you to talk about, sexual orientation. So we've always had to kind of maneuver the waters to be able to get our messaging out. I can remember when my youngest daughter was in about the 5th grade, one of my prevention specialists on the team was in her school, and that particular school didn't want her to say that she was coming from this. When I worked at the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center, that we were with the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center. We would just say we're a community organization. But my daughter was raising her hands like, don't you work with my mom at the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center? And they kept trying to shush her down. So we've always had to maneuver through some of these things in the rape crisis and the domestic violence movement. So I think we kind of built for this, but this is a little bit different because it's scary. Survivors shouldn't have to pay for healing after being victimized. And that's one of the things that we have always in our field been able to be proud to say that survivors don't have to pay for those services. And that's one of the things that I hope to maintain as a leader at Hope and Healing, that we don't have to go there.
Right. All right. I thank you so much, Teresa. And we're going to be back to you in a couple of minutes with a question and answer. I want to hand it over to Hilda, but I do want to just reiterate something that you said, Teresa, because I'm going to come back to it later, which is when other things begin to fall through, you have to look to your social capital. That's where your influence is. That's where a whole bunch of things that you need when you get short of money. So, but thank you for bringing that up. And Hilda, off to you.
Thank you. And so I'm going to ask you to take a breather after those two conversations. We're sort of bridging into another framework, another set of ideas to help you think through the impact of these changes in your organization. And we realized that it's predicting what it will cost to deliver your services is not easy, but it's pretty doable. The challenge comes from the revenue side and understanding, as you're doing your risk analysis, what are the risks associated with each of these sources. Now, of course, today's been all about impact of government, and we realize that government does come with significant risks today more than ever. But every source of revenue that I have on this slide here has both its opportunities and its risks. And what I'm encouraging leaders on the call to do is to really reflect on what is the composition of your revenues across these 6 areas. What is what's been the history with these sources of revenue? And we realize that when one revenue fails us, we look to others. And so what might be your revenue diversification strategies? And diversification of revenue is often put as like the first strategy when one revenue fails. And of course, that comes with it the interesting questions around how do we build the ability to bring in revenue or contributions from other sources that we haven't done before. And so what I'd like to share with you is this idea that revenue is a 3-dimensional framework. And the link that you see here is an article that we published recently. I encourage you to take a look. It's a light read, and yet one that really helps leaders think about what are the 3 dimensions of my revenue and what are some of the assumptions that maybe we're making that aren't necessarily the right assumptions unless we really dig deep into those sources of revenue. So the 3 dimensions as we've seen them starts with diversification. And yes, there is, of course, this goal that we don't have all our eggs in one basket. For example, if today we've concluded that government is 75% of our revenue, need I say more? The diversification risk comes to mind. But diversification is only one of those risks or those elements of the dimensions. The second is the flexibility. And I'm going to go through it just quickly, a few examples. It's not enough to say that I'm X% government and X% foundation. I really need to be thinking about how flexible are these dollars. And we know government, by definition, tends not to be flexible. But we also know private dollars sometimes are not as flexible as we would like. And so there is a concept that we've discussed more and more with foundation program officers that we call flexible program funding. And for those of you from my previous slide, that foundation is a significant portion of your revenue. It doesn't have to be that a foundation grant is either unrestricted or line item restricted, meaning 50,000 for salaries, 10,000 for benefits, et cetera. There is something in between that is called flexible program funding. So if you can present your financial story that goes behind each of your proposals as these are the outcomes that we are envisioning for this program, and this is sort of an outline of what the costs will be, and we commit to delivering on these outcomes for this $50,000 grant, that's really where we need to be. For the foundation program officer that is charged with only investing in after-school program, and maybe you're a multi-service organization, this flexible program funding for the after-school program gives you as the leadership the ability to say how those dollars will be spent. So diversification, flexibility in as many ways as possible, flexible programs funding, something that we're seeing more and more foundations being open to. And then the third is this element of predictability. So if you can envision looking at your $2 million budget and actually slicing that budget into the diversification framework, the flexibility, and the predictability. So the same $2 million quantified in these three different ways. So the first example I want to give you with regard to revenue diversification, this is an organization that we worked with some years back, and the foundation called us in to help them understand what had happened. The organization was, according to the foundation, doing really well. And all of a sudden, typically on a Friday afternoon, the organization closed its doors. And that was hard to understand because from the sort of top level revenue analysis, this organization was 55% government, 35% foundation, and 10% individual. So there were assumptions made around the level of flexibility. How could it be that this organization would close its doors? It only had 55% government funding, which was really the assumption that the rest, the 45%, was flexible. But in fact, it wasn't. When we looked at the actual sources of foundation funding, some of the foundation grants were just as restrictive as government. And so what this organization really had available from an unrestricted use as you need perspective was only 15% of, I think there were about a $2.5 million budget. So again, I'm using 2 million just for my example. My first recommendation here is how does my 2 million pie chart look from a flexibility perspective, where I, as a leader, can allocate revenues as I need to allocate. So that's the first part. The second part is this idea of the predictability of the revenue. And so again, my $2 million example, I'm building the budget for this year. What percentage of that budget is committed? And so I'm speaking of budget, but this is part of that risk analysis that I was saying before. As of today, for my calendar 2025, how much of my revenue is committed? And in Dana's early point, she talked about how the good news of government was that it was committed. You had a signed contract. That may not necessarily be the case should things change for those sources. But from what you know today, how much is completely committed to the organization? How much is likely to come in? You have a history with this funder. You know that they've given for the past few years. It is likely to come in. You have close conversations. And then the last part of the pie is the to be identified. And as you might imagine in the risk assessment, the to be identified is the riskiest part of the revenue. And we want to be thoughtful about what expenses are we thinking that we are going to cover with this 10%. And so in the risk analysis, you're sort of saying, well, what can I do with the committed dollars? What can I deliver? What if I only had half of the likely? And what if I had none of the to be identified? This is that other dimension of predictability. And in terms of tools or ways of thinking about it, think of taking your total pool of revenue and putting them into these classifications. So committed, again, already confirmed, it's secured. Maybe you raised it in the past and it's released from restriction in this year. You've got the pending. Maybe you give some sort of likelihood or attribution as to the possibility that this may happen. This is where the partnership between development and finance becomes really strong. Development is in the best position to know where this funder might be. And then the third is this idea of to be raised and no specific source. What is the remaining revenue that the organization needs to raise? And so build a tool that is flexible, that will allow you to update these assumptions, and that will allow you to have this partnership with development finance program in understanding where your revenue dollars lay today as you're doing, you're having many a conversation around that risk analysis that I mentioned earlier. And so I'd like to open it up now for Q&A, and I believe that Wade is going to be moderating this part of the program. And I'm going to stop sharing and Wade, ask you to please let us know what's come in.
Sure. Actually, Hilda, a question just came in as you were speaking, and it comes from Kim. And what Kim's asking is, we built our budget based on our contracts, that is committed funds, but that's been, in Kim's words, blown to bits. How do we analyze that? That's what they need the tools for. So really, I think that's just where do we begin, you know, in this very quick shock and awe world?
Yeah. So we think that these are the areas that are going to be affected, and then another executive order is released, and now it's a different source. And so I would encourage, starting from those contracts, classifying the contracts themselves by level of risk based on the sources, and then thinking about, well, what does the budget look like if these are the contracts that make it? What if it was these contracts? So it sounds like it's already a conservative budget because there wasn't to be raised and there wasn't likely, it was all committed. So now it feels like the committed is needs to be reimagined.
I mean, this gets back to what Dana said originally at the very beginning of this session, is we used to think, or some people used to think, of government money as being the most reliable renewable source under normal circumstances. That has been blown to bits, and it's a very charged political environment. So you, in a way, you have to really take stock of what likelihood there is of that political environment holding sway over the programs that you run. And that's a really tough, it's tough until they actually say, no more, you're getting no more money. But when you look at the groups that have already been cut, I mean, you'll see groups all over the country that have cut 150, 200 personnel because they happen to be either in climate or international stuff or refugee and immigration stuff, with just like that overnight cutting stuff because they really are just kind of worried about bleeding out. And I think those are very serious considerations. I think the other thing that's really serious is for organizations that have gotten used to running programs that, for instance, have facilities, buildings attached to them, those kinds of things. There's a whole series of contracts that you have to look at in relationship to what you thought was going to be your revenue that now may be the fixed costs that really endanger your survivability. And so these are all things that are interconnected, and you have to be very intimate with your budget and then be able to actually stay on top of things. And Wade said something about shock and awe. This strategy that's being used with nonprofits right now is just to create so much confusion and arbitrariness that we really don't know which end is up until it finally lands. And for some organization, they've got a pretty good, prior indication, but for some of us, we're not really sure what it's going to be. And I think that's kind of where Teresa is right now, right, Teresa?
Yeah, and I think I'm looking at the grants that we have that we believe may be impacted because of the work was outlined inside the grant, right? And so we know that work is very essential to the community we're serving. And like we work closely with a hospital because of the Child Advocacy Center. And that's some federal dollars that we have received to help implement that work. But that work actually might be at risk. That grant might be at risk right now. So we're having conversations with that local hospital like, hey, today we have the funds, but there's a potential that we may not have the funds tomorrow. And in order for this CAC to be accredited, you have to have this community partnership. Do you all have some funding to help supplement? What can you potentially do so we can continue the work in the community that we know needs to happen? So we're having those conversations, looking at those grants. Who are the partners? Is it a local government entity? So we're thinking about the federal government, but it's really time to have those conversations with your local government individuals and build those relationships if you haven't already built them, and saying, hey, this is the potential that may happen. How might you be able to help us? What are the core services that we need to keep afloat and that's going to impact the community? And how might you help, whether it's at the city level or at the county level?
Right. Yeah, and as you all were talking about this, Mary Ann and Norma came in talking about Medicaid and their dependence on that, risk of state and county grants. So really this analysis is extending all the way across the board, not just the federal side of things.
But somebody asked a question here about, well, how do you approach your board about this stuff? I mean, I think when you do a scenario plan, you've got to get into the scenario. Maybe this is going to go south. We would hope that this will go north at the same time, and there'll be some balance, but maybe it won't. But and that's why when you have the organizations that have a really significant chunk that's dependent on government money, Teresa could do everything in her power to make this program compliant. It could still get defunded, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we just have to be prepared for that. It's arbitrary. And they don't like the idea of using gender analysis. Well, what hope do we have?
Yeah, and I think it's a time that when you talk about boards and just volunteerism, period, that it's a time to like really focus on that right now. I know volunteerism since COVID has been totally different, but I think people right now want to know what they can do to help. And volunteerism is a space. So create your volunteer program, maybe re-engage with volunteers in community, really identify those key positions on your board that's missing and recruit for those positions. If you need somebody on your board that has a financial background, an HR background, to help you through layoffs, if you have to potentially lay off instead of having the necessary pay for legal representation, you might need to just really strategically identify individuals that's missing in your board and start asking for that help from the community.
And I would just jump in and say, yes, at the board level and at your volunteer level. For example, one of the things we've started doing is engaging our volunteers to go to city council meetings. We have our volunteers wear bright orange shirts. So if we can get them and they see that as volunteer work to go to those meetings, wearing their bright orange shirts, voicing, the same message over and over and over again, we think that's really impactful.
There were several questions also, and this really extends to Lauren and Teresa. Along with the board interface, how about discussions with your team, with your staff on these uncertainties and the upcoming decisions that are possible?
Well, I like to approach communication at a tiered level. I start with my C-suite, of course. We have the conversations and things that we need to share down to the directors, the management team, and then have town hall meetings or all staff meetings to share the information. We have really talked about that, if we lose some funds, there will be a restructure. It's not, will it be? It will be a restructure. And we're uncertain of what that means today, but we are working on plan A, plan B. We talked about, this is what we have in reserves, and this means that we are able to operate for 6 to 8 months.
Mhm.
Our goal is to take that 6 to 8 months and stretch it to 10 to 12, which will mean that restructure to take place. So staff understand that we do have some reserves, that we have the ability to maintain stuff at a certain level. And that was really helpful for staff to hear that information. But it wasn't like we're shying away from the fact that there will be some restructures. And we're going to focus on rehiring essential positions only, instead of if we have some natural transition that take place. We're not going to be quick to just post positions. We're going to analyze if this is a position that has flexible funding, that we may able to take that funding and place it to operations so we can pay the bills. And then look if there's somebody else in the agency that was doing something similar, looking at productivity to see, are we maximizing the most out of the positions that we currently have? Do we have things that are nice to do? Or these are things that we must do for the community? So we're really looking at every factor in that way.
Well, and for us as a small organization, again, we're 6 people, so it can be sometimes a little bit easier. And as a part of equity work, of course, being honest with folks and being fully transparent is really critical for our organization. So we never shy away from it. And because we see that every person in our organization is a part of the work. If they understand why we need to kind of tighten our belt on this or move away from this program for right now, they're on board with that much more easily. So we're very, very transparent. Again, we're fortunate that our board, our whole structure is set up for that transparency, but it's been really helpful, I think, for our team to be on the same page at all times, because it is tricky work and it's tricky times. And so we don't want anybody feeling like they don't know what tomorrow holds.
Thanks, Lauren and Teresa. We're so appreciative that you both joined us for the session. The clock in this case is not our friend, and I must continue us along. I think I'm handing things over to Ruth.
Okay, so geez, there's so much more to say here. And this stuff is complicated, and it's can be heartbreaking. So I just want to say again, we've been here before in various ways. I was running a battered women's program in Kansas when 90% of our funding was withdrawn. We had 90% of our funding through LEAA, which was a federal program. They dismantled the entire agency, and we lost all of our funding all at once. And we had to shift to local funding, and we managed to do that within 3 or 4 months. It was a hard strategy, but we had to start it with who cares? Who cares about us? And who's willing to work to make sure that what we've built here is able to survive. Can we go to the next slide? I'm sorry. Okay, so and to the next one. Okay, so I want to say that, the issue of people asking you to change your language, not to say you're anti-racist, not to say that it's violence against women that we're looking at, not to in any way bring any of our ideology into our work, it's not an accident. The next slide actually should go before, which is, can you go to the next one? Yes, our words create our worlds. And so if we give up our words too quickly, we end up not even noticing that our worlds, that the worlds that we have defined as being, what we want and what we need out of this planet are going to be gone in a minute, because we've stopped saying what it is that we want and what we envision. So let's go back for a minute and just here is one way that you can look at trying to figure out if you need to create a little bit of room in your organization, and you have you have a small budget and unrestricted money that you're playing with at all, one of the things that you want to do is to figure out what's sacred and what's not in the work that you do. And the principle here is that there should be a lot of things that are not sacred and some things that are. There will be a lot of things that you can have other people do, and some things that you absolutely have to anchor and that are the absolute core of your meaning to the world. That core of your meaning to the world is your call on all of that social capital that Teresa was just talking about and Lauren was talking about. If people see you as being principal leaders in something that they care about, and you call on them to help you, they may be way more likely to do that than if you decided that you're going to call racism workforce development. Or something similar, which I think is one of the suggestions that Lauren got about their work. The fact that we're being asked to change our kind of everything from our belief systems to our identity as organizations, it's actually a really serious threat to who we are and to democracy in general. But more, in financial terms, it's incredibly important because it gets in the way of our being able to call on other people who believe the same way that we do, because we're not so obviously who we meant to be anymore to them. If you do have them close to you, you can call on it for everything from political will and influence to extra hands to do the actual work, and voices to talk about the work, information, and finally money. Social capital is under many conditions convertible to financial capital. And you need to keep that in mind, that if you don't have social capital, establishing a small donor base is going to be incredibly much harder than it would be if you do have social capital. Because that's what gets converted, people's belief in you. Okay, going to the last slide. I want to get to that really quickly before we. Okay, and this is a hard one. Now I'm going to tell you who did this because this list, which I left out the first, the top five, the bottom 5 leverage points in the system, but these are the most powerful leverage points in a system. When you think about how can I affect my operating environment, these are the ways that have the highest leverage in terms of affecting your operating environment. And I'm just going to go, they've already, kind of made an attack on the rules of the system, the structure of information flows. Luckily, we have our own structures of information flows amongst ourselves, and we need to really nurture those. But the power to add, change, evolve, or self-organize a system structure. And this is essentially what both of our interviews were talking about today, is that you have to keep self-organizing, and that the more you have transparency in the system, the more you're aligned, the more you can reorganize your system structure so that it works even in grueling conditions. If you were to take prior conditions as the conditions. The goals of the system, and this gets back to how do we talk about ourselves? Are we a program that addresses violence against women primarily? Are we a program that addresses racism primarily? Can we talk about the ideology behind that and the need for personal change in those areas, or are we dulling all of that down? It's a very high leverage point to really be clear about the goals of your system, and then the mindset or paradigm out of which the system out of which the system evolves is incredibly powerful leverage point. So if you can keep these things in mind, I know that people are scrubbing their websites, and it hurts my heart to see that. I would tend to be somebody who would come out bolder on whatever it was that I was saying. I don't have federal money right now. We did back then. But you know, it's going to, those answers are going to be different for everybody. How can you keep your message really clear? Do as little damage as you can to your constituencies, keep them motivated to keep working and making, you know, the entire system kind of more friendly to all of us. It's going to be a bunch of excruciating decisions that we're going to be in the middle of, and the more people we have advising us on that and talking about the real possibilities for making change within our own organizations and within the fields that we work in, and the federal government, the better off we're going to be, local government as well. So that's it for me. I just wanted to really urge you to feel some strength in who you are, and don't give that up too easily. Make sure that you have the ability to to continue to lead from the front. And from the middle. So that's it for me. I wanna say thank you so much for coming. Remind you, please, we do need your donations. It's harder and harder for us to raise money from sponsors because they're all feeling the economy right now as well. Please do, if you feel like you get value out of these conversations, make sure that you donate today. And I want to thank everybody, Hilda, Dana, and especially Teresa and Lauren, for sharing so generously with us. And make sure that all of you, you know, that when you see people struggling next to you, that you reach out and that you help them in some way, because it makes a huge difference to know that we have friends around us. Thank you so much.